I attended seminary, Russian Orthodox seminary in New York State,
Uh-huh.
and part of that was learning the basics of the modern Russian language and also Old Church Slavonic, which we use in our church services.
Mhm.
When I ended up becoming a monastic at a monastery in West Virginia, which is where I live now, uh, I thought that the basics of Russian that I had learned were at seminary would be left behind with my seminary life. But as it turns out, my my duties here at my monastery in West Virginia, include giving tours to visitors, and we have, because we're a Russian Orthodox monastery, we have many visitors who are Russian speakers.
Mhm.
So I was tasked with the assignment of learning Russian. And so before meeting you and before starting Russian Morning Podcast, uh, learning Russian on my own basically amounted to buying books and maybe doing, some kind of play programs on the internet and so forth, but nothing systematic. So I did do some systematic coursework at seminary,
Uh-huh.
where
Okay.
I learned the basics about, some things about cases and some things of all the basics of the language, but nothing kind of on a practical level, if you will. It was still very much textbook oriented. So
Uh-huh.
that's basically my history of learning Russian on my own before starting a Russian Morning Podcast with you. Maybe 9 or 10 years ago now, 8 or 9 years ago,
Uh-huh.
um, 2 semesters of
Uh-huh.
Russian,
Uh-huh.
beginning Russian. And then
Uh-huh.
I stopped for a number of years uh,
Mhm.
until I was given this task of trying to learn Russian.
Uh-huh.
So uh, then that was probably I would say another year, maybe 2 years, but it was always very unfortunately it was always low on the priority list because we have so many other duties here at the monastery. So, uh, but when you gave us the opportunity for me to study with you directly, then the abbot of the monastery blessed for my Russian studies to be put very near to the top of my duties. So thank God for that. The main challenges I'd say were probably two.
Uh-huh.
One was that uh, mm, I didn't have somebody who was there to help encourage me in a systematic way, as a teacher, as somebody to inspire me, somebody to maybe to keep me accountable.
Uh-huh.
So that's been a very helpful piece for
Uh-huh.
Russian Morning Podcast because you care about us, your students, and so you're very diligent about checking in and making sure that I understand everything, and so um, that that helps me a great deal in terms of being faithful to my studies. And then the other thing that I didn't have was, um, something that was practical. So I think a lot of the textbooks are very grammatically driven, you could say, and they're not quite so contemporary and day-to-day Russian. They're very pragmatic. They're very abstract, I should say. So um, I knew a lot of things. I knew a lot about Russian, but I can't honestly say that I was learning very much Russian. So that makes sense. Well, we were blessed to have some friends of the monastery who accompanied us in Moscow for the week, and then in Optina Monastery in southern Russia near Kaluga for 2 weeks. And that was, of course, we couldn't have done it without them. And basically, we relied exclusively on them to interpret and to make everything comprehensible. I
Uh-huh.
knew basics. I could read signs, but I really didn't understand anything that anybody said, or very, very little, and I
Mhm.
spoke even less, so I spoke basically nothing. I used mostly the computer,
Uh-huh.
uh, and I also would download the audio component and put it on the phone, because my duties in the monastery require me to go frequently to the local airport or bus station.
Uh-huh.
So I download it onto the phone so that I can listen to the podcast on the way to the airport or bus station, on the way back, things like
Uh-huh.
that. So
Nice.
both. So basically, the phone and the computer. I missed having an instructor because you were always available if I had questions.
Yes.
So so it was it was it just felt natural. I guess you would say. So
Uh-huh.
I felt like I had a safety net
Uh-huh.
studying the Russian Morning podcast because I could ask you questions
Uh-huh.
and look at different aspects of the lesson that that you could develop for me. You could answer questions about some of the funny things that stick out to me in language. So I felt like I did kind of have an instructor in you. So I didn't feel like I was doing it all by myself. No, it was great. It was great. There's an element of self-study that is difficult because there's no there's no reference point if you're just by
Uh-huh.
yourself. Uh,
Exactly.
and so having you and the Russian Morning podcast gave me a reference point. So that's been very helpful. Uh,
Uh-huh.
but there's also an aspect of self-study that's nice because you're somewhat independent, and
Mhm.
so I also experienced that with Russian Morning Podcast because I could go at my own pace, and a lot of times the pace that I go at is not it's not dictated by me. It's dictated by my duties here in the monastery. So I felt like I could always pick up wherever I left off with Russian Morning Podcast. 3 or 4 hours for each of the lessons. I'm I might be a little bit slower than some, probably not faster than most, but I tend to like details, and so I'd spend 3 or 4 hours in the lesson and really
Uh-huh.
try to absorb kind of the structures of the language that I was given in the podcast and in the text. Oh, I like it because
Mhm.
uh, first of all, when I listen to something,
Uh-huh.
when you do the format, this kind of the steps of the Russian Morning Podcast,
Uh-huh.
you're allowed to listen to something without feeling like you have to get it all the first time. So
Exactly. Mhm.
so basically, every step of the way is a victory because I listened to it the first time and maybe just get 10%. But it's
Exactly.
okay because I'm going to listen to it again at a slower speed and get
Mhm.
a little bit more. And
Mhm.
then, then I'll get to listen to the vocabulary and listen to it, then listen to it again, and I'll get a little bit more. And I can feel my brain expanding when I do this, working my mental muscles. So
Hmm.
so as there are other things that I'm listening to now on my own that I also use the Russian Morning Podcast method um, to listen to, like Nisyuti Suti, that
Uh-huh.
audiobook.
Uh-huh.
hmm what I came to conclude about that is that um, if something is overwhelming, it's because I allow it to be overwhelming. And
Uh-huh.
um, that happened to me initially just because I thought that I had to get everything at once. But then when I realized, even in the Russian Morning Podcast, that everything is broken down into steps and
Yep.
you're allowed to learn at an incremental rate,
Yep.
that's encouraged, then I
Yep.
was able to kind of take a deep breath and say, okay, this is not overwhelming. I'm able to get a little bit each time, and I can go at my own speed. So, and another aspect that I really appreciate is
Mhm.
sometimes because of time constraints, I would go over a lesson that I would complete the lesson and I would get benefit from it, but I would know that I could always go back and get more benefit to it when I go back and look at it again. So there's kind of a layered quality to the lessons. So you can get a certain amount out of it. And if you're interested in moving on to the next theme or topic, let's say, you can move on, but you can
Uh-huh.
also go back. So I've gone back and I've listened to old lessons before when I'm driving or things like that. So
Uh-huh.
kind of stay fresh on those things. And it's also just to refresh my memory on the vocabulary of those topics. The method I used Quizlet. I also used kind of some flashcard type, study stuff of the vocabulary.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I think I retained an immense amount, but I don't know how to quantify it. One, I guess, anecdotal way to describe it is that when I went on this year's 3 weeks Russia trip, I understood so much more Russian than I did last year. just vast amounts more of Russian than I did last year. So that's the only way I can think of it, is that it helped me incredibly in Russia, because I didn't really use anything else. This past year, I've only used Russian Morning Podcast.
Uh-huh.
So in the entirety of my Russian studies. So so my listening comprehension was so much better. And there were a few instances this year's trip where I was put in a position to translate for my fellow monks that I was not put in that position last year, but circumstances kind of arranged that this year, and I translated, and it was really thrilling and very enjoyable. Of course, I didn't get everything, but that would have been impossible last year, I'd say. So forgive me, I don't know how to put percentages or quantify how much language I learned, but it was like night and day between last year's trip to Russia and this year's trip to Russia. Well, and those things came up in conversations when we visited monasteries or when we visited other places in Russia and St. Petersburg, because people wanted to know, what do you eat? Where do you live? How do you live in America? What's your monastery like?
Right.
What's your culture like? And so that was of course very helpful to have all those vocabulary terms from my Russian Morning Podcast lessons. But for me, even more important than that is just to I was able to, through Russian Morning Podcast, I've begun to kind of absorb the structure of the language. And so to me, vocabulary is not as important as the structure of the language, because if I know the structure of the language, then I can kind of use context clues to guess, what's being said. And so I don't need to know as much vocabulary if I know that oftentimes in Russian a sentence will start with a word in the accusative case, let's say, and it'll end with the subject, just depending on how the speaker wants to frame something. So knowing those kinds of structures helped me immensely, and I was able to learn those structures just through the Russian Morning Podcast and having audio and text to use. I tend to rely heavily on visual aids, so reading and grammar notes. But the fact of the matter is that the spoken language is entirely, without, you don't have a script whenever you're having a conversation with somebody. So there are many other supports you have to look to help you understand and make your way through a conversation in a foreign language. And so I've tried to move away from over reliance on the grammatical notes and the text. So I still use them, but I also rely more on the audio now. So perhaps you could say I'm finding a better balance than I was early on. It was very helpful for me to realize that I don't have to understand every word that comes out of a person's mouth. That I kind of listen to the flow of the conversation, and rather than listening for individual words, I'm listening for phrases, for set phrases, for structures. So, for prepositional phrases, for example, or for certain ways ways that Russian uses to describe things. So oftentimes, for example, the third person plural is used to say, people believe this, or people eat there, or people say this. And we don't talk that way in English. We speak differently. Yeah. But once I understood that feature of Russian speech, it became much easier to understand a whole host of expressions and a whole kind of number of examples, in conversation of people talking like that. So, so the trick for me primarily has been to not worry too much about vocabulary, not to over worry about it, I should say, and to focus more on just listening to the flow of the speech and just kind of getting kind of an impression of what a person is saying. And I found that most of the time I actually understood everything the person was saying, or most of what the person was saying, and I was able to answer their questions. And only occasionally would somebody say, no, I meant something else. And then they just repeated it in a different way. And it was a very natural way for the conversation to be brought down to my level. I didn't have to stop them and say, I'm sorry, I don't understand. It allowed me to take more risks, you could say. So being, taking risks and not trying to, it's one of these situations where there's an expression, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And
Yes.
so I think that was the case for me, is realizing, oh, I don't have to understand everything perfectly. If I understand it well enough and just look for
Yes.
larger trends and larger structures and patterns, then I can understand a lot of things. The first benefit definitely is that you have audio, uh, and you have text, and you have uh, grammar notes to it, just to explain things. So a lot of times, if you're listening to the news in Russian or listening to something in Russian, uh, it when it's just audio and there's no text, it's very difficult. And conversely, when you're reading the text but there's no audio, I can get a false assurance that I understand it, but if I listen to it spoken, then I realize, oh, I don't understand it spoken. So it's completely different. So having audio and text was hugely important.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the way that the way you underlined certain vocabulary features in each lesson, that was helpful, uh, because it meant that I didn't have to underline everything. And I know that sounds funny, but what I mean by that is that it was guided in terms of how I was learning and the focus of what I was learning. Because to be quite honest with you, the class, I think probably I was maybe not quite at the level, where I would have gotten the most out of the class, but I
Mm-hmm.
was still able to get an incredible amount out of the class because you were kind of leading the way. So if there were other things that you didn't focus on in the vocabulary, for example, it was easy for me to look them up. And so that the lesson didn't get kind of bogged down in my own shortcomings, you could say. So that was a benefit. Um, Also, having access to the audio and being able to listen to it over and over again was a benefit. Uh, Having access to you and being able to ask you questions was, to me, it's the best benefit of the program, is that you're so willing to answer questions, to follow up and to reply to my emails. And um, uh, also, I like the fact that there were 3 lesson blocks on a theme and not just one lesson on one theme and one lesson on another theme, because there was enough overlap that I felt like I could, there was a larger arena in which to kind of learn the topics and the vocabulary terms of a topic. And so that was helpful to have overlap. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but the overlap feature of the lessons was very, very helpful. The infographics were really helpful because
Uh-huh.
a unique feature of Russian, well, as opposed to English, is that um, we don't rely in English on prefixes and verbs, especially, for example, the way you do in Russian. So having having a verb root or verb stem with the different prefixes, and explaining that in the infographics. So zaiti, daiti, paiti, all those different kind of prefixes. You had the infographics for those, and that was very helpful because there was a visual component as well.
Mm-hmm.
That helped me immensely, because otherwise you're just looking at words that only have 1 or 2 letters difference, and it's just becomes a alphabet soup after a while. So having the visual component was very helpful. The
Okay.
mind maps were also helpful, but I
Uh-huh.
learned for myself that the mind maps, uh, at least for me, that I couldn't just study them in kind of a quick way. They're a little bit more, they were the most beneficial for me when I was able to spend time with them and just kind of look at them and just kind of absorb them. So it's a little, to my mind, the mind map was more right brain than left brain, if that makes sense. So that's
It does. Mm-hmm.
because it's spatial. There's a spatial component, so
Uh-huh.
you can remember where things are spatially related to other things. So that's a different, kind of a supplemental way to learn vocabulary terms. So I did find that helpful too. I think it would serve the needs of a lot of Russian language learners.
Hmm.
If you have a person who has the desire and the time and the ability to just devote all their time to studying it, they will be greatly enriched in their ability to understand and to speak Russian. Uh, if you have somebody like me, perhaps, who has that spirit, but my life circumstances don't allow me to devote as much time to Russian study as I would like, it also is very well suited because I can. There are times when I'm given assignments where I have to be away from the computer or whatnot for a certain period of time, and I can always come back and just pick up where I left off. I don't feel like I have to start all over again. So there's kind of a safety net feature there. Uh, I think because you are accessible to the students with questions and you're checking in with us and things like that, uh, that that is helpful for people also like me who like to have feedback and who like to have human interaction. So
Hmm.
that's very. I think anybody who's looking for that, I think will find that in the course. And ultimately, to to learn Russian, to learn a foreign language is an investment. So it's an investment of time and it's an investment of resources. And the I would say the return on your investment is significant for those who want to study with you and to do to do your program. And I've found that for myself in my own experience. So it's been a blessing. Hmm.